She had $12 in her checking account and a final eviction warning taped to her apartment door. 24 hours later, Joanna stood in the foyer of a $90 million estate she now legally owned. But the real wealth wasn't the imported marble floors. It was locked in the basement. Joanna's boots left dull, damp smudges on the polished hardwood of the law firm's waiting room. She stared at the marks, then at the receptionist, who was doing a terrible job of pretending not to stare at her worn canvas jacket. Joanna was 34, running on 4 hours of sleep, and smelled faintly of the industrial bleach she used to scrub the floors at the county medical clinic. Her 10-year-old son, Leo, sat beside her, tracing the intricate pattern of the leather sofa with a small, quiet finger. "Mr. Hewitt will see you now," the receptionist said, her voice tight. Joanna stood. Her knees popped. She didn't have time for this. When the certified letter had arrived at her complex yesterday, she almost threw it in the trash. Trench and Associates, estate settlement. She assumed it was a predatory debt collector trying a new angle. But when she called the number, ready to unleash a tired woman's fury, a paralegal had simply offered to wire her $500 just to cover her missed shift and gas money to get to their office. The money had cleared in 10 minutes. That was the only reason she was here. Giles Hewitt's office smelled like cedar and expensive coffee. He was a man composed entirely of sharp angles, sharp suit, sharp nose, sharp gaze. He didn't offer her a drink. He didn't waste time with small talk. He just pushed a heavy, brass-bound folder across his glass desk. "Harrison Trench passed away 14 days ago," Hewitt said, his voice flat. "I don't know who that is," Joanna said. "He was your maternal grandfather's brother. He had no children. He had no spouse. He specifically amended his trust 6 months ago to locate his closest living blood relative, regardless of their prior relationship. That is you." Joanna narrowed her eyes. She had lived long enough on the razor's edge of poverty to know that nobody hands you a winning lottery ticket just because you share a bloodline. "Okay, so what's the catch? Am I inheriting his gambling debts? A timeshare?" Hewitt didn't smile. He opened the folder. "You are inheriting the Trench estate. It is a property located in the Northern Ridge. The land alone is appraised at $40 million. The structure and its contents bring the valuation closer to 90. The property taxes have been prepaid for the next 100 years through an irrevocable trust." He slid a set of heavy, archaic-looking keys across the glass. They clinked together, cold and heavy. "It's yours, Joanna. Free and clear." Joanna stared at the keys. She looked at Leo, who was swinging his legs, completely unaware that their reality had just fractured. She felt no joy. She felt a deep, twisting spike of paranoia. "People don't just leave $90 million to a stranger," she said, her voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "What did he do for a living?" Hewitt paused. For a fraction of a second, the lawyer looked uncomfortable. Mr. Trench was a logistics contractor. He handled specialized supply chains. "The keys are yours. The address is in the folder. My firm's obligations end the moment you sign this receipt." 2 hours later, Joanna's sputtering 2009 Honda Civic groaned as it climbed the steep, winding mountain road. The city fell away below them, replaced by dense, suffocating pines and a heavy, dropping fog. "Are we going to a hotel, Mom?" Leo asked, clutching his backpack. "Nobody," Joanna said, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "We're going to look at a house." The road ended abruptly at a massive, wrought iron gate. It wasn't ornamental, it was industrial. Joanna recognized the reinforced steel bars and the heavy hydraulic hinges. It looked like the entrance to a Federal Reserve, not a mountain retreat. She rolled down her window. The freezing air bit into her skin. She held up the heavy magnetic key fob Hewitt had given her to the scanner. A heavy clunk echoed through the trees. The gates swung inward in absolute, eerie silence. Joanna drove through. The driveway was nearly a mile long, winding through perfectly manicured but lifeless grounds. And then, The house loomed through the fog. Calling it a mansion felt like a joke. It was a sprawling brutalist fortress dressed in a thin veneer of luxury. Dark slate stone, massive floor-to-ceiling windows made of glass that looked suspiciously thick, and sharp, geometric wings that seemed to dig into the mountain itself. She parked near the grand entrance. The silence up here was absolute. It pressed against her eardrums. Joanna unlocked the massive front doors. They swung open, revealing a cavernous foyer lined with imported marble. But it didn't look like a home. There was no art on the walls, no dust either. It was sterile. "Whoa," Leo whispered, his voice echoing into the dark hallways. Joanna stepped inside. The air was climate-controlled, carrying a faint, metallic scent. She dropped her keys on a small mahogany table. They clattered loudly. She had $90 million in real estate beneath her worn-out boots. She could sell it. She could take the money, disappear, and never scrub another floor. But as she looked down the long, shadowed corridors, that cynical, survivalist instinct flared in her chest again. Harrison Trench didn't build a fortress just to sleep in it. He built it to keep something out. Or to keep something in. They spent the first 3 hours just trying to understand the layout. The upper floors were standard, albeit excessive, luxury. 10 bedrooms with bare mattresses wrapped in heavy plastic. Commercial-grade kitchens with stainless steel appliances that looked like they had never been touched. But everywhere Joanna looked, her unease grew. She noticed the details. The hinges on the bedroom doors were reinforced steel. The windows didn't open. They were sealed shut, and when Joanna tapped a knuckle against the glass, it didn't ring. It thudded. Ballistic glass. "Mom, look at this," Leo called out from what was supposed to be the master study. Joanna jogged in. Leo was pointing at a massive oak bookshelf that covered the entire back wall. But it wasn't the books that caught his attention. It was the floor beneath it. There were faint, arc-shaped scuff marks on the hardwood. Joanna walked over. She pushed against the side of the heavy oak unit. It didn't budge. She ran her hands along the spines of the old, leather-bound books. One of them, a heavy volume of military history, felt loose. She pulled it. A heavy, mechanical thud resonated from within the wall. The entire bookshelf hissed, a pneumatic seal, breaking, and swung smoothly outward. Joanna pulled Leo behind her instinctively. Beyond the bookshelf was a steel door with a biometric scanner and a heavy numerical keypad. The keypad was dark, but a small slot at the bottom sat waiting. Joanna remembered the strange, heavy key fob she had used at the front gate. She pulled it from her pocket and slid it into the slot. A green light flashed. The heavy steel door popped open. "Stay close to me," she whispered to Leo. They stepped into a descending stairwell, illuminated by harsh, red, tactical lighting. The air here was colder, humming with the low vibration of massive servers. At the bottom of the stairs, the narrow hallway opened up into a sprawling subterranean room that made Joanna's heart stop. It was a command center. Wall-to-wall digital maps dominated the space, glowing with dormant, faint standby screens. Long tables were bolted to the floor, covered in radio equipment, satellite uplinks, and heavy encryption hardware. Along the far wall were rows of reinforced glass lockers. Inside them hung rows of tactical gear, matte black ballistic vests, heavy assault webbing, night vision optics, and neatly racked, highly modified rifles. This wasn't the basement of an eccentric, rich man. This was the nerve center of a highly organized, heavily funded private military apparatus. Joanna walked slowly into the room, her boots silent on the rubberized flooring. Harrison Trench hadn't been a simple logistics coordinator. He ran an army. She approached the main central desk. It was dominated by a massive multi-screen terminal. In the center of the desk sat a heavy, lead-lined lockbox and a single, handwritten envelope with her name on it. Joanna. She picked up the envelope. The paper was thick, expensive. She tore it open. "Joanna." If you are reading this, my perimeter protocols have confirmed your identity, and I am dead. You likely know nothing about me. That is by design. I did not leave this estate to you out of family affection. I left it to you because I watched you for 5 years. I watched you work 3 jobs. I watched you refuse handouts. I watched you fight viciously for your son's survival. You are deeply cynical, completely unattached to power, and utterly ruthless when backed into a corner. You need to understand what you now own. I am the founder of the Aegis Group. We do not fight wars. We control the assets that win them. The accounts linked to this property hold roughly $2 billion in liquid funds. But that is pocket change. Joanna stopped reading. She looked at the heavy lockbox on the desk. $2 billion. Her brain couldn't process the number. It was a fiction, an abstraction. She forced her eyes back to the letter. Inside the lockbox is a physical ledger and a set of transfer protocols. It represents absolute, unquestioned ownership of a global network of specialized tactical personnel, and more importantly, the exclusive patents and subterranean drilling rights to a massive deposit of an element that will render current energy grids obsolete. Governments do not know we have it. Tech billionaires are spending hundreds of billions trying to synthesize it. We simply dug it up, and my men are standing on it. The ledger inside that box transfers the entire operation, the men, the weapons, the land, the future of global energy, to you. Do not sell it. If you try to sell it, the people who want it will simply kill you and take it. You cannot run. You cannot hide. You can only command. Joanna's hands began to shake. She looked around the cold, red-lit room, the rifles, the servers, the maps displaying strategic choke points across the globe. She wasn't just rich, she was suddenly one of the most powerful people on the planet, and she had a target on her back the size of a continent. "Mom!" Leo's voice was small, terrified. "What is this place?" Joanna slowly folded the letter. The exhaustion that had plagued her for a decade vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp spike of absolute adrenaline. She looked at the lockbox. Then she looked at her son. "It's our new business, Leo," she said, her voice dropping into a flat, dead calm. "And we have a lot of work to do." Joanna opened the heavy, lead-lined lockbox. Inside rested a thick, leather-bound ledger and a single black satellite phone. The phone was heavy, devoid of any brand markings, featuring only a numeric keypad and a single green call button. She looked at Leo. He was sitting on a metal crate marked with military serial numbers, kicking his heels against the steel. He looked so small in the red tactical lighting. She couldn't take him back to the roach-infested apartment. But keeping him here meant stepping into a war zone she didn't understand. She picked up the phone. She pressed the green button. It didn't ring. A click echoed on the line, followed by the steady breathing of a man on the other end. "Protocol designation," a deep, gravelly voice demanded. Joanna looked at the inside cover of the ledger. There was a string of letters and numbers printed in block ink. "Echo 7 Tango Black," she read, her voice steady despite the hammer beating in her chest. Silence stretched over the line. "Harrison is dead." "Yes," Joanna said, "and I have the ledger." "Location." "You know my location," Joanna replied, leaning into the cynical edge that had kept her alive on the streets. "I'm in his basement, the mountain estate. How fast can you get here?" "Wheels up in 10. On site in 40. The line went dead. Joanna set the phone down. 40 minutes. She had 40 minutes to transform from a woman who clipped coupons for canned beans into the commander of a private army. She opened the ledger. The pages were filled with accounts, troop deployments, supply chains, and offshore banking routing numbers. It was a staggering empire of violence and control. She flipped to the back. A detailed manifest outlined the asset, a subterranean drilling site in a sovereign exclusion zone, mining a synthesized isotope. The numbers next to the valuation were incomprehensible. "Mom," Leo whispered, "are we in trouble?" "No, Leo," Joanna said, walking over and kneeling in front of him. She grabbed his shoulders. We are the trouble now. I need you to go upstairs. Pick any bedroom you want. Lock the door. Do not come out until I come get you. Understand? Leo nodded, his eyes wide. He grabbed his backpack and hurried up the concrete stairs. Joanna turned back to the command center. She needed to look the part. She stripped off her bleach-stained canvas jacket. Underneath, she wore a simple black t-shirt. She walked over to the glass lockers. She punched in the code she found in the ledger. The glass slid open. She bypassed the heavy plate carriers and grabbed a lightweight black tactical jacket. It fit well enough. She looked at the rifles, then shook her head. If she needed a gun to command these men, she had already lost. 38 minutes later, the proximity alarms on the main console flashed yellow. A live satellite feed on the central monitor showed 2 black, unmarked helicopters descending through the thick mountain fog, landing on the expansive rear lawn. Joanna walked up the stairs, moving to the main foyer. She stood in the center of the massive, empty room, her hands clasped behind her back. She kept her posture rigid. She had spent a decade dealing with abusive landlords, predatory loan sharks, and aggressive shift managers. Men with guns were just another breed of bully. You never break eye contact, and you never blink first. The heavy front doors swung open. The wind howled into the sterile foyer, bringing with it the smell of aviation fuel and wet pine. 4 men stepped inside. They moved with the terrifying, synchronized fluidity of apex predators. They were dressed in sterile black tactical gear, carrying suppressed compact submachine guns resting on single-point slings. The man in the lead was tall, older, with a network of pale scars cutting across his jawline. His eyes were flat, gray, and completely devoid of warmth. He looked at the vast empty mansion, then stopped 10 feet from Joanna. He evaluated her in one sweeping glance, taking in her cheap boots, the borrowed jacket, and the dark circles under her eyes. "I am Commander Hayes," the man said, his voice matching the gravelly tone from the phone. "Aegis Group 1st Division, you are the blood relative." "I am Joanna," she corrected, her voice echoing off the marble. "I hold the ledger. I own the estate." Hayes didn't smile. He stepped closer. The 3 men behind him shifted their weight, their hands resting casually near their weapons. Harrison Trench built Aegis from the ground up. He was a tactician, a warlord. He didn't hand the reins to a civilian cleaner because he thought you were capable. He did it because you were a blank slate. Unconnected. Untraceable. "He handed me the reins because I don't break," Joanna countered. She took a step forward, closing the distance. She looked up into Hayes's gray eyes. "I read the manifest, Hayes. I know about the isotope. I know governments are searching for it, and I know your men are currently sitting on it. You need funding to keep that perimeter secure. The accounts are frozen. Only the biometric scanner on the ledger can release the payroll. You don't have to respect me. You just have to work for me." Hayes stared at her. The silence in the foyer was absolute, save for the distant whir of the helicopter rotors. He was testing her, looking for a flinch, a tremor in her hands. Joanna gave him nothing. She thought of Leo upstairs. She thought of the eviction notices. She channeled every ounce of her exhausted, bitter rage into an unyielding stare. Slowly, the tension in Hayes's shoulders released. He gave a microscopic nod. "Payroll is due in 48 hours. The perimeter at the dig site is hot. We have drones probing our airspace daily. If you are taking command, you need to understand the asset. You need to see the vault." "Show me," Joanna commanded. Hayes led her back down into the bunker, ignoring the command center entirely. He walked to the far wall, pressing his palm against what looked like solid concrete. A hidden biometric panel scanned his hand, then requested a secondary input. He stepped back and gestured to Joanna. "Your grandfather coded your DNA profile into the master system before he died. Place your hand on the scanner." Joanna pressed her hand against the cold stone. A mechanical voice chimed. Identity confirmed. Primary shareholder. The concrete wall split down the middle, groaning as thick hydraulic pistons pushed the heavy doors apart. Cold, stale air rushed out. Beyond the doors was a massive industrial freight elevator. "Get in," Hayes instructed. Joanna stepped into the metal cage. Hayes followed, pressing the lowest button on the panel. The elevator lurched, descending rapidly into the earth. The temperature dropped sharply. "The isotope isn't mined here," Hayes explained as they descended in the dark. "The dig site is located in a geopolitically unstable region. But the refined product, the initial yield that proves the concept and holds the primary value, is stored here, beneath your feet." The elevator ground to a halt. The metal grate slid open, revealing a cavernous, brilliantly lit underground hangar. Joanna stepped out, her breath catching in her throat. Imei, the space was larger than a football field, carved directly out of the mountain's bedrock. Forklifts moved silently across the polished concrete floor, operated by men in gray jumpsuits. But it wasn't the scale of the facility that shocked her. It was what sat in the center of the room. Surrounded by thick, lead-lined glass walls was a massive, glowing cylindrical core. It pulsed with a faint, deep blue luminescence, casting long, eerie shadows across the hangar. Thick, cooling pipes fed into the top and bottom of the glass containment unit. "That is the core," Hayes said, his voice lowering to a reverent murmur. "A stable, self-sustaining energy source. A single ounce could power this entire estate for a decade. We have 2 tons of it in there." Joanna walked slowly toward the glass. The heat radiating from the containment unit was palpable even from 30 feet away. She was staring at the end of the fossil fuel era. She was staring at trillions of dollars, but as she stared at the glowing blue core, a chilling realization washed over her. Harrison Trench didn't build a fortress to keep people out. He built it to hide a bomb. If the cooling systems failed, if the containment breached, this mountain would cease to exist. She turned to Hayes. "Who else knows this is here?" "Nobody," Hayes replied. "Only the men in this room, and you." "Then why are there proximity alarms blaring in the command center?" Joanna asked, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Hayes frowned. "Oh, what?" Joanna hadn't mentioned it upstairs. She had seen the yellow lights flashing on the far left console just before the helicopters arrived. But those alarms hadn't been triggered by the airspace. They were subterranean sensors. Before Hayes could reach for his radio, a deafening explosion rocked the hangar. The concrete floor violently shuddered, throwing Joanna to her knees. Dust and debris rained down from the cavern's ceiling. The brilliant white lights flickered, died, and were instantly replaced by the blood-red glow of emergency backups. Gunfire erupted from the far side of the hangar. "Ambush!" Hayes roared, drawing his weapon. He grabbed Joanna by the collar of her jacket, hauling her behind a stack of heavy steel shipping crates. "Keep your head down." Joanna gasped for air, tasting cordite and pulverized concrete. She peered around the edge of the crate. A section of the far bedrock wall had been completely blown inward. Armed operatives dressed in gray urban camouflage were pouring through the breach, laying down a merciless wall of suppressing fire. Aegis personnel scrambled for cover, returning fire. The deafening roar of automatic weapons echoed endlessly in the enclosed space. Sparks flew as bullets ricocheted off the steel walkways and heavy machinery. "Who are they?" Joanna yelled over the chaos. "Mercenaries," Hayes shouted back, firing controlled bursts toward the breach. "Corporate kill teams. Someone leaked the location of the refined yield." Joanna's mind raced. A leak. But Hayes had just said only the men in this room knew. Her grandfather had been paranoid. He had isolated this facility. The only way someone knew the exact coordinates of the subterranean vault was if someone inside had given it to them. She looked at Hayes. The veteran commander was laying down heavy fire, deeply engaged in the firefight. But Joanna's cynical instincts, honed by years of trusting no one, flared to life. She remembered the ledger. She remembered the transfer protocols. Only the biometric scanner on the ledger can release the payroll. Hayes didn't need her to command the men. He just needed her alive long enough to access the funds, or to act as a scapegoat when the core was stolen. A bullet shattered the concrete inches from Joanna's face. She flinched, crawling backward. She scanned the room. The invading mercenaries weren't aiming for the core. They were laying down covering fire, while a specialized team moved methodically toward the main control terminal that regulated the containment unit's locking mechanisms. They were here to steal the isotope. Joanna didn't panic. Panic was a luxury for the rich. She felt that cold, familiar survival instinct take over. She looked around the crates. Resting on a yellow forklift 10 feet away was a pneumatic bolt rifle used for securing steel plates. She locked eyes with Hayes. He was reloading. "Cover me," she screamed, not waiting for a response. Joanna broke cover. She sprinted across the open concrete, diving into a slide as a line of bullets chased her across the floor. She slammed into the side of the forklift, gasping for breath. She reached up, grabbed the heavy pneumatic rifle, and checked the air pressure gauge. It was fully charged. She peeked around the forklift tires. The specialized extraction team had reached the terminal. One of them was plugging a heavy decryption drive into the console. Joanna aimed the pneumatic rifle. It wasn't a precision weapon, but it fired solid steel bolts with enough force to pierce an engine block. She didn't aim for the mercenary. She aimed for the heavy, pressurized coolant pipe running directly above their heads. She pulled the trigger. The heavy rifle bucked in her hands. The steel bolt tore across the room and slammed into the high-pressure valve of the coolant pipe. The pipe ruptured with a catastrophic hiss. A massive cloud of freezing, opaque chemical gas violently sprayed downward, instantly enveloping the extraction team. They screamed as the supercooled liquid struck their armor, blinding them and completely freezing the decryption drive. The sudden eruption of chemical gas created a massive smoke screen, halting the mercenaries' advance. Hayes seized the advantage. "Push forward, suppress the breach," he roared to his men. The Aegis personnel rallied, laying down a punishing volume of fire into the tunnel breach, forcing the surviving mercenaries to retreat into the dust. Joanna dropped the pneumatic rifle. Her hands were shaking violently. She leaned against the forklift, forcing herself to breathe. Hayes jogged over to her through the dissipating smoke. He looked at the ruptured coolant pipe, then at Joanna. His flat, gray eyes registered something new. It wasn't just respect, it was genuine caution. "You breached a primary coolant line," Hayes said, his voice tight. "If that pressure doesn't stabilize in 10 minutes, the core will overheat." "Then you better fix it," Joanna snapped, stepping out from behind the forklift. She walked right up to him, ignoring the blood running down her cheek from a grazing piece of shrapnel. "Because if this mountain blows, we all die. And if I die, your payroll is locked forever." Hayes stared at her. "Someone betrayed us. Someone sold the coordinates." "I know," Joanna said, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "And we are going to find out exactly who it was. Lock down this facility. Seal the breach. No one leaves this mountain." Hayes nodded slowly. "Understood, Commander." Joanna didn't smile. She turned away from him and walked back toward the freight elevator. She had $12 in her checking account yesterday. Today, she owned a private army, a subterranean fortress, and the most dangerous energy source on the planet. She pressed the button for the upper floors. Like to, she had to go check on Leo. She had to make sure her son was safe, because starting tomorrow the real war began. She was no longer a mother scrubbing floors to survive. She was the architect of a new empire, and God help anyone who tried to take it from her. The elevator doors slammed shut, sealing her in the dark as she ascended back to the surface. She leaned her head against the cold steel wall. She had inherited a kingdom of rust and blood, and she was ready to rule it. The doors opened to the sterile foyer. The house was quiet again. She walked up the grand staircase, her heavy boots leaving a trail of gray concrete dust on the pristine marble. She reached the bedroom where she had left Leo. She knocked softly on the heavy reinforced door. "Leo, it's Mom. You can come out now." The lock clicked. Leo peeked out, his eyes wide, clutching his backpack. I heard a loud noise down deep. Joanna knelt, pulling him into a tight embrace. The smell of his shampoo grounded her, cutting through the adrenaline and cordite. Everything is fine, buddy. Just some old pipes settling in the basement. She stood up, holding his hand. She looked down the long, empty hallway of her $90 million fortress. Are we staying here, Mom? Leo asked. Joanna tightened her grip on his hand. She thought of the glowing blue core beneath their feet. She thought of the hardened mercenaries dead in the hangar. She thought of the infinite power locked behind a biometric scan of her hand. Yeah, Leo, Joanna said, her voice hard as diamond. We're home. The dust has settled, but Joanna's war is just beginning. She traded a mop for a mercenary army, and now the whole world is in her crosshairs. What happens when a desperate mother gets her hands on limitless power? We are diving deeper into the Aegis Group's bloody corporate war in the next video. If Joanna's brutal rise to power hooked you, hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter.